Welcome to Unit 4. I'm going to switch masks right now. This is a new mask I'm going to be wearing that's kind of creepy. It's creepy because it has this little clear thing to it, so I wanted to introduce it to you nice and slow. Also, but it's helpful, maybe you can like see me talking now at least, but also you can see me breathing, which is kind of creepy too. If this gets too weird, let me know. I'll go back to my other mask. I just figured you might want to see my mouth moving. It can be helpful for people who are trying to understand what it is that I'm saying. So welcome to Unit 4, our live session. We're talking all about deductive arguments today. We're going to be discussing specifically how to evaluate arguments and diving into the weeds on it. So I'm excited. Before we get started, though, with that conversation, what I like to always do is start talking logistics first of all. So I'm going to go to our Blackboard course page, which I thought I just shared with you. Where did it go? Let me try it one more time. There it is. It just took a while. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's due this week, what you have to do for this particular unit. So I'm going to go to the course content folder and scroll down to the Unit 4 folder. And then scroll down. I already told you we're talking about deductive arguments in class this week. Scroll down. Here are the slides we're using in class today. Scroll down a little bit more. This is the reading. You only have one required reading, and it's pretty short. It's only 3 pages, so you don't have a ton of reading to do for this particular week. So hopefully you'll get a sense of it. There's also an optional reading, which I recommend doing because this optional reading called the Steelman technique right here is helpful for one of your assignments this week. Your first assignment is a discussion board where I'm going to ask you to steelman an argument or steel figure an argument. And this is the one I was foreshadowing last week when I said that the Unit 3 discussion board and the Unit 4 discussion board are connected. That's what's going to be happening now. We've got the connected part connecting back to Unit 3. I liked all of your posts in the Unit 3 discussion board. You brought up some really nice controversial stances and defended them. Now what I want you to do for Unit 4 is choose someone else's argument from that discussion board, particularly an argument toward a conclusion you disagree with. Try to find somebody you disagree with, maybe someone you disagree with the most. And then the whole goal in this initial post in this week's discussion board is to just explain that argument. Don't copy it word for word, just read it a couple times and then stop looking at it and write out your explanation based off of your understanding of the argument. You're just trying to accurately present the argument. You're not criticizing it, you're not saying what's wrong with it, you're not saying why you disagree, you're just explaining someone else's argument. And also, your goal is to steel figure the argument. We talked a little bit about steel figuring last week, or steel manning as some people call it. There's a whole article on that here. You try to figure out the best version of this argument. Try to defend this argument as much as possible, which I know is hard and weird. I'm not expecting you to be perfect at this because your instinct is probably going to be to criticize this argument. Your instinct is going to be a hater and hate on this argument. But I want you to just defend it, even though it goes against your position. Olivia, your hand was up. Go ahead and unmute yourself. Tell us your thoughts.
For the response, do we have to like mention whose argument it was?
I think it would be helpful if you did that, just so that for my sake, I can go back and compare to see how well you did. And it might also be helpful for other students when they're trying to reply to you later on this week to see, like, to compare how well you did to the post that you're trying to explain. So yeah, it might make sense to say like, hey, I chose Shanae's argument. Here's my understanding of Shanae's argument. Or, hey, I chose Isabel's argument. Here's my understanding of Isabel's argument. Something like that. And then the last thing you want to do in your initial post is describe how it felt to defend an argument that you disagree with, to steelman an argument that you disagree with. Just tell me literally your emotions. How did it feel to you? That's your initial post. As always, the initial posts are due Saturday. And then you get to keep talking about this, reply to others, 2 replies due on Wednesday. Questions, thoughts, or concerns about that? Again, we're sort of being vulnerable here. I asked you to be vulnerable this week in coming up with arguments that are potentially controversial, or you might know ahead of time that students in this class will disagree with you. And now I'm asking you to pick an argument where you're already saying you disagree with it and trying to explain that argument. So any questions, thoughts, or concerns, post them in the chat. Hit that raise hand button like Olivia did. Happy to answer them. One thing I'm discovering is that it's a little bit harder to breathe and teach at the same time. I have to talk slower, or at least make sure I take big breaths in between when I speak. This is us learning together. I'm excited. All right, and the other graded assignment this week is a homework assignment. So this is a homework assignment that is a lot like your participation activities. The only difference between a homework assignment and a participation activity is a homework assignment is at least partially graded on how well you do on it, but not a ton. The way I grade homework assignments is, as long as you complete all of it, you get an A. But you could get an A minus or an A or an A plus, depending on how well you do on this homework assignment. So that's the range of possible grades you could get if you complete all of it. If you don't complete all of it, but only complete some of it, that's the only time you'd get a grade lower than an A. And this homework assignment is all about deductive arguments. You'll see I'll click on it. Hey, why don't you, there we go, it's taking its sweet time. There are 2 pages to this homework assignment. The first is just about evaluate arguments. We'll be learning a ton about that in class today. So there are 8 arguments to evaluate. And then the second page is some multiple choice questions, and then a bit of asking for examples of arguments that fit particular parameters. Provide an example of a valid argument that has a false premise, or an invalid argument with all true premises, etc. for each one of these. You'll be asked to provide original made-up examples, not examples that you find online, not examples that we used in class. Make up your own original examples. And I think of this homework assignment as kind of like a practice test. Next week, we're going to be having our first test in Unit 5. And this homework assignment is structured in such a way that I'd say most of the test looks like the different sections on this particular homework assignment. There's one part of the homework that looks a little bit like what you did last week for your Unit 3 participation activity, but most of it looks like this particular sheet. So this is a chance for you to practice what you're going to be tested on next week. And at the end of today's live session, we're going to be looking at this homework assignment in greater detail and maybe talking about tips for how we can go about answering some of these. Because there's a little trick here. One of the interesting things is that you might love multiple choice questions because they seem so easy. I think the multiple choice section of this homework assignment is the hardest section on it. I think it requires a lot more thought and effort than a typical multiple choice section. So we'll talk about it. We'll get to there. That's due as our normal due dates on Wednesday of next week by the end of the day. Those are all our graded stuff. We've got a homework assignment due Wednesday, your discussion board, initial response due Saturday, 2 replies due Wednesday. Any questions, thoughts, or concerns about either of these assignments? Feel free to write no in the chat. Feel free to hit that raise hand button and tell us your question or concern. Feel free to write your question or concern in the chat if you do have a question or concern. Let us know what you're thinking. All right. So Barbara says, is the test next Friday? Not exactly. The test is next week, but we're not having the test in class. The test is something that you can take at any time next week. So we're not going to be taking it during class next Friday, but after class on Friday, if you wanted to take the test, you could. Or if you wanted to wait till Saturday to take it, you could. Or Sunday or Monday. The last day you'll get to take it next week is going to be that following Wednesday, which, what is that, October 9th? Let me check real quick. October 7th. Yeah, that's going to be the last day you can take the test, is October 7th. Monique, the test actually technically is going to open up on Thursday next week. So you could technically take the test before class next week. It'll be available starting Thursday at midnight. But yeah, it'll be totally open and available, Monica. During the live session next week, we'll be reviewing for that test and talking a lot more about on it. So we'll talk way more about next week's test during next week's class. All right, so good questions all. Another thing I wanted to point out while we're on this particular kick is that your grades have been posted for pretty much everything that you've submitted up till now. Everything in Unit 1, Unit 2, and Unit 3. Let me just pause to answer William's question really quickly. In the chat, William wrote, we have to use the lockdown browser thing. Yes. For those of you who are familiar with that Respondus lockdown browser, I'm going to be asking you to use that. Not with a webcam. I think some of your classes might ask you to do that, but yes, with the lockdown browser itself. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry. I'll explain it all in obnoxious detail next week. So you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about then. Going back to what I was saying, if you go to the My Grades section of your Blackboard course page, you will see grades entered for everything in Unit 1, just the discussion question, both things in Unit 2, the discussion question and the participation activity, all three things in Unit 3, the discussion question, the participation activity, and yeah, even got to this extra credit for anybody who handed this extra credit. So you should see for all of those assignments at this time. They should be on the right side here. And I feedback on your Unit 1 discussion questions, on anything you got less than perfect on your Unit 2 and Unit 3 discussion questions. I did not feedback on your Unit 2 participation activity. I did not feedback on your Unit 3 participation activity. Your Unit 2 participation is your own rational life plan. You can decide for yourself how you see it fits into your life. There's an answer sheet for this participation activity on understanding arguments back in the Unit 3 folder, so you can compare your answers you give on this understanding arguments participation activity to the answer sheet with explanations. So somebody raised their hand, and I didn't get to see who that was. If whoever wants to unmute themselves and ask your question or raise your concern, let me know.
So, Professor, this is Shanae. So,
Hey.
I noticed that you had wrote a comment under my participation activity. I didn't know that all of them had the premise and or conclusion, because I was trying to find the keywords and I didn't find some in certain parts. That's why I wasn't able to underline it.
Aha. So if you want to, what I suggest you do, I think if I remember correctly, you like didn't write anything on 3 of those arguments. You can submit what you think the conclusion is for each of those 3 arguments to me, and then I'll just bump your grade from whatever you got to full credit.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, and just a general piece of advice for participation activities. The only time I give you lower than full credit on a participation activity is if you don't answer all of the questions. So Shanae talking leaving some blank, and it sounds understandable because there are some on there that don't have any premise indicators or conclusion indicators, but at the very least, you have to underline the conclusion for each of those arguments in each of these. And then it looked like Monique had a question in the chat. Monique asked, how's the extra credit graded? So I did provide feedback on your extra credits. If you take a look, I have this like program through Blackboard where I can circle things and underline things, like these like thick blue lines all over whatever it is you submitted. Or if I couldn't draw on what you submitted, I just wrote in feedback in the comments. Basically, you got 1 point for everything you tried on the extra credit. You got 1.5 points if you tried it and got partly right. You got 2 points for everyone you tried and got perfect. So the grades are probably, since there were 10 arguments on the first page and 1 thing on the second page, you had the possibility of getting 20 points on the first page. And then I did that second page weird thing that was a long argument. I gave that out of a total possible 5 points. So possibly you could have gotten 25 total. So the extra credit is graded based off of that sort of scale. And I didn't mark exactly how many points you got for each one, but that's how I'm thinking about it. If you want to know exactly how many points you got on each particular one, feel free to email me and I'll let you know. Oh, and Monique asked this thing about safe assign, what assign score? That's a scary thing for most of our assignments. That's to check for whether you're plagiarizing or not. Most of your safe assign scores for their participation activities and extra credits should be really high because most of you are just copying and pasting the same thing that everybody else is copying and pasting. That doesn't matter for these particular assignments because I'm not asking you to provide original work. So I probably should have just turned safe assign off for these assignments. I didn't, sorry about that. But assign just checks for plagiarism to see like how much does what you submit look like other work that have already been submitted. So if you were writing an essay, I would want to check that safe assign percentage to see whether you were copying too much and maybe plagiarizing, or you were fine and not copying. But for these assignments, you don't have to worry about that safe assign score. No problem. All right, so what's the verdict on this mask now you've seen it for a few minutes? I can always switch back to this mask. You find this mask too creepy and weird? Are you okay with this mask? What do y'all think? Give me some feedback. All right, it's cool. I like Shanae's, it's okay-ish. Corey giving the most diplomatic answer possible. It's interesting. Interesting could mean fully positive or fully negative or anywhere in between. Yeah. All right. I'm going to keep using it just in case there are people who value lip reading in some sort of way. And this. Monique says my screen's black. Oh, no. All right, go ahead and come back. Yeah, it's definitely something you haven't seen. It's a mask that's designed to help individuals who are members of the deaf community or the hard of hearing community. Lamar says it's a statement. I certainly don't wear this mask out in the real world because this is a legit scary mask. If you saw this out in the real world, you'd be like, you're doing masks wrong. You got a big old hole in your mask. So out in the real world, I use these regular masks. But for teaching, when I figure I'll be talking a lot and people might be looking at me, I figured I'd use it. All right, that's enough about me. Let's start getting now to our big topic today, talking about deductive arguments, talking about evaluating deductive arguments. So in this particular case, we're going to go to these slides that connect back to where we ended class last week. Last week, we were talking about understanding arguments, if I remember correctly. This week, we're going to talk about evaluating arguments. And hopefully, I can make it so that to do it. Yes, the slide's the whole screen. I'm so excited that I found out this feature. It's very easy to keep me happy. But the way we evaluate arguments is in this three-step process. After we understand an argument and really know what the premises of an argument are, what the conclusion of that argument is, then we're ready to evaluate the argument, figure out whether it's good or bad. Then ultimately, our big goal in this class is to get to the point where we're good at developing our own solid, logical arguments for positions we happen to hold. So last live session, we did that. Today, we're going to be doing evaluating arguments. Let's get into this. When we evaluate an argument, we're just trying to figure out whether the argument's good or bad. That's how we evaluate anything. And what we're going to do this particular first part of the live session is think about a bad way of evaluating arguments first, and then contrast that with a more successful way of evaluating arguments. I think it's going to be helpful to talk about this common bad way and talk about why it's bad, and also talk about why it's common, and then see how bad it is by comparing it to a good, more successful way of evaluating arguments. And then we're just going to spend a lot of time collectively evaluating a bunch of different arguments. I'm just going to throw a bunch of different arguments at you, and you're going to have to tell me whether it's a good argument or a bad argument. You're going to have to get into the details about whether it's a solid argument or not so solid an argument. So let's start it. Here is that bad method I was just talking about. According to the common bad method of evaluating arguments, all you got to do to evaluate an argument is figure out whether the conclusion is correct. By this method, once you judge the conclusion and you got a correct conclusion, you got a good argument. Once you figure out the conclusion and you got an incorrect conclusion, you got a bad argument. That's how this method evaluates arguments. Now, I've said already that this is not a good way to evaluate arguments. This is a bad method. I got a skull and crossbone on this slide. Do not do this. But this feels intuitively plausible. I bet many of us might think like, well, what's so bad about that? I mean, isn't the goal of an argument to get us to a correct conclusion? Isn't the goal of an argument to just hand us that actually true, correct conclusion? What's so bad about judging an argument based off of its output? Did it get us there to the right answer, or did it not get us there to the right answer? That's maybe a defense of this bad method. And yet, I still think there's something wrong with this. What do you think has gone wrong with this particular method of evaluating arguments? Tell me yourself. Raise your hand, post in the chat. Why is this method a bad method? What's gone wrong here? I got one person ready already. I'm going to call on Lamar. Go ahead.
Hey, Professor. It's bad in the sense that, all right, if you're judging the conclusion already, and if you already figure that, you know, it's correct or incorrect, now any of the premises that are presented, you're not looking at them with like a unbiased view. You know, you're not looking at them whether if they actually make sense or not. You're already going into looking at it in a light to where, you know, it justifies what you concluded the conclusion to be, whether that's correct or incorrect.
Yeah. So Shantae likes what you said. And it also seems like Shantae also was writing a lot of the same sort of points that you were just saying, Lamar, as well. I really like what you were saying, Lamar. First thing you said is that we want to talk about the premises. And this bad method doesn't mention the premises at all, right? An argument isn't just a conclusion. An argument is a conclusion backed up by premises. We want those premises to also be part of what we evaluate. And Shantae very explicitly says this in the chat. What if the premises have nothing to do with the conclusion? Even if the conclusion's true, wouldn't that be a bad argument, right? We want there to be a connection between the premises and the conclusion. So that's something that this particular method is just missing entirely. The other thing you said that I really liked, Lamar, is you used the word biased. And there could be something very biased about judging an argument based off its conclusion. If you jump right to the conclusion of an argument and try to judge whether that conclusion is true or false, before you look at the evidence for that conclusion, you're saying you already know the answer. You're saying this argument can't change your mind whatsoever. You're coming in biased, either for the conclusion or biased against the conclusion. And that is the exact sort of bias that I'm concerned about that makes this a common method. This bias is known as confirmation bias, or on the opposite end, disconfirmation bias. And it's something I want us to be on the lookout for. So I'm really glad you mentioned that as well, Lamar. But to go back to your first point, Lamar, that dovetails with what Shantae was saying in the chat, this method completely ignores the premises. We care about the premises of an argument, as well as the conclusion. And the method describing just misunderstands slightly what an argument's goal is. An argument is not supposed to just give you a correct conclusion. An argument is supposed to prove to you that that correct conclusion is correct. An argument is supposed to offer evidence in the premises that the conclusion is true. It's the difference between seeing a really complicated math problem and somebody just giving you the answer versus somebody showing exactly why, step by step, that correct answer is the correct answer to that math problem. I'm with your math teachers on this one. Whenever a math teacher would take off points on your tests when you circled the right answer, but you didn't show your work, so you got points off for showing your work, I think it's important to show your work. And an argument is essentially showing your work. Not only did you get the right answer, the conclusion, but you show your work to explain why that answer is the right answer. And that's the premises. The premises are the crucial bit that's missing in all of this. So Shante also mentioned this point, that there are lots of bad arguments that have true conclusions. So here's an example of a bad argument with a true conclusion. Premise 1, my cat's name is Mia. Conclusion, I have a twin sister. Well, you probably don't know this for sure yet. Maybe I mentioned that, I forget. But I do, in fact, have a twin sister. But do you think this is a good argument for that conclusion, that I have a twin sister? It's clearly not a good argument, right? Yeah, what specifically has gone wrong in this particular argument? Thanks for saying no, Shante. Thanks for saying no, Barbara. Thanks for saying no, Denzel. What specifically is the flaw in this particular argument? Yeah, as Shanae writes very nicely in the chat, there's no relation, right? There's nothing about what's going on in premise 2 that has to do with what's going on in the conclusion. It may very well be true that my cat's name is Mia. And by the way, it is. I do have a cat named Mia, that's true. But that doesn't tell you at all whether I have a twin sister or whether I don't have a twin sister. There's no relationship whatsoever. And this goes exactly back to what Shante was saying earlier in the chat. This is an example of an argument where the premise has nothing to do with the conclusion, even though the conclusion is true. So that would be this method going wrong. This method would say this is a good argument, when clearly this is a bad argument. All right, so the better way of evaluating arguments is right here. The good way of evaluating arguments is figuring out whether the premises provide good enough evidence to show us that the conclusion is correct. Figuring out whether those premises provide good enough evidence to show us that the conclusion is correct. This is so important, I repeated it twice. So let me talk about some reasons why this is a good method. First and foremost, notice how this method talks about all parts of the arguments. This premise talks about the premises. This method talks about the conclusion. We talk about all parts. And this method also highlights the fact that we care about the conclusion being correct, but we don't just care about being given a correction. We care about whether the evidence has shown us the conclusion is correct. Has this argument shown its work? Are the premises evidence for that the conclusion is correct? And that's what we really care about. When we're judging arguments, we're judging the quality of evidence in an argument. And that's mostly the premises. So let's talk a little bit about this phrase, good enough evidence. It's somewhat vague the way we framed it right now. Let's talk about what it takes for an argument to have good, high quality evidence. What are some qualities of good evidence? What are some characteristics? Feel free to shout it in the chat. Feel free to raise your hand. What are some good qualities of good evidence? What's good evidence look like? What does good evidence do right? Think about it in terms of good evidence versus bad evidence. Shantae says good evidence supports the conclusion. Absolutely, Shantae, right? One of the things you mentioned earlier in the chat is that a bad argument might have premises that have no relationship whatsoever to the conclusion. A good argument does the opposite of that, has a strong relationship between the premises and the conclusion, such that the premises offer logical support for the conclusion. Now, Monique and Barbara mentioned some really nice things. We also want to make sure our premises are indisputable facts, are themselves correct. It's a bad idea to bring up a bunch of lies in your premises to support your conclusion, because lies are bad evidence for a conclusion. Generally, we want the truth as our evidence. And Barbara says, more specifically, we can resources to back up those facts in this particular case. Excellent. William has another way of describing what I think Shantae's describing here. We want the information in the premises to, in some sense, accord to or connect to the main idea, that is the conclusion. So yeah, we want there to be some sort of informational connection. And that's the way I think of the idea of support. So y'all have nailed the two things that I care about. Good evidence is true, indisputable facts. Good evidence also supports the conclusion. The premises provide enough information, like William was saying, to help us figure out the conclusion from that information. This is it. These are the only things we care about when evaluating an argument. Just these two things and these two things alone. So sometimes you might have done something like this in other classes, or read something that's like the 6 factors for good arguments, or the 7 tips you need to succeed when evaluating arguments. I think in this class, all that really matters are these 2 things. Good evidence is true. Good evidence supports the conclusion. That's it. Truth and support. Truth and support. We're going to be saying that so much in this class. That's going to be something that's just going to be a mantra. We're just going to keep saying over and over and over again. And I feel like because Shantae and Shanae have been in one of my classes before, I feel like that's why they're doing a good job in answering some of these questions about what counts as good evidence. Shantae's probably remembering how much we talked about support in the philosophy of law class we had together last semester. We talked so much about truth and support in that class. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we understand this. Yeah, good, Shantae. Yeah, I only want to be known in y'all's memory as the truth and support guy. If there's anything you remember about your weird critical thinking teacher 20 years from now, I hope it's not this dumb mask. I hope it's, oh, wasn't Sean that truth and support guy? He just kept talking about truth and support over and over again. So anyway, here's an argument that fails the truth test. My phone case is circular. I'm showing you my phone case right now too, with my phone. All circular cases are big, therefore my phone case is big. What do you think is specifically wrong about this argument? What's the flaw? All right, Isabel, nice. The premise is just false, right? My phone case is like a rectangle. It's not circular. It's shaped like a rectangle. Most phone cases are shaped like a rectangle because most phones are shaped like a rectangle. So there's an argument that's bad because the first premise is false. We don't have to know anything else about this argument. We know it's a bad argument because it failed the truth test. One of the premises isn't true. All right, so I'm going to call on Shanae. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
So I remember in the classes that I was with you, we mentioned that you can't put all in a premise because it is not true, because sometimes your phone may be smaller than an original regular phone, and it's like saying all circular cases are big. That's very false. You can't say all.
Yeah, so it's harder to make an all statement true than it is for other types of statements. So I think that second premise is also false. So yeah, y'all could have also disagreed with that second premise. It's so weird to even think about circular phone cases because I don't know any phones that are circular. Does anybody have a circular phone case? A circular phone, a phone that's like shaped like a circle? But if it were true, they're probably small circular cases, medium circular cases, big circular cases. So that second premise also seems implausible, unlikely to be true. Good. So another good analysis here, again, on the truth side of things. So very cool. Oh, there's a pear phone from Victorious? I don't even know about this. I'm going to have to look this up, Monique. A pear phone? That kind of sounds fun. Oh, the TV show. Oh, okay. So maybe that's true, or maybe that's just made up in their world. I don't know. Maybe you want to buy it, though. All right, here's an example of an argument that fails the support test. My first name is Sean. My last name is hyphenated. There's a hyphen in it. Keegan-Landis. Thus, my water bottle is teal. So what's specifically the flaw in this argument? Why is this argument bad? First name Sean, last name has a hyphen in it. Therefore, my water bottle is teal colored. What's the flaw? Excellent, Isabel. There's no relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Barbara, no correlation whatsoever. Absolutely. Shantae says the same thing. Olivia, the conclusion doesn't correlate with the premises. That's the idea of support. There's got to be a logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. That's what we want an argument to do. We want the premises to like logically lead, like point to the conclusion. And in this case, they don't, right? Makes no sense to say, my first name's Sean, my last name's hyphenated, thus my water bottle is teal. You can't conclude anything about my water bottle from those first two sentences, even though, by the way, those first two sentences are true. The premises are true. These true premises just don't support the conclusion. All right, so the idea of support is itself somewhat tricky because it comes in sort of degrees or scales. And the key idea is there's a part of your test that counts as enough support. And up until that point, you can have some support, just not enough. So I'm going to give you an argument, and then I'm going to keep trying to add to the argument. And I want you to tell me when we've reached the point where I've given you enough support to conclude that I grew up living in South Jersey. So what if I tell you that I grew up in America? Does that prove that I grew up living in South Jersey? Have I given you enough support? Pretty clearly no, right? Excellent, Shantae and Isabel. Specifically because America is just way bigger than South Jersey. I could have lived in all sorts of other places like Atlanta or Seattle or Iowa or New Mexico. Name your random places of choice. Excellent, Shantae. Now, what if I give you some more info? What if I tell you that I grew up by the Delaware River? So the Delaware River is that river that separates Pennsylvania from New Jersey. It's the border. It also separates, I guess, New Jersey from Delaware at the bottom part. So Franco says that that's still not enough. What do the rest of y'all think? You agree with Franco? If so, why? Why isn't this enough? Ooh, Franco getting specific with some roads. I-80. Yeah, I-80 in North Jersey, right? And I-80 connects northern Pennsylvania to northern Jersey, or North Jersey. I guess nobody calls it northern Jersey. Awesome. And Ashante says, this is nice. It does narrow it down a little bit, right? Now, the likelihood that I grew up in South Jersey is a little bit higher than me just telling you I grew up in America. Now, maybe I'm on the Pennsylvania side, maybe I'm on the Jersey side, but I might be on the North Jersey side or the Central Jersey side in Trenton, or I might be on the Pennsylvania side in Philadelphia or Philly. Awesome. Very well put, Barbara. What if I had this premise? What if I tell you that growing up, I spent most of my time in South Jersey? Is that enough support to show that I grew up living in South Jersey? I spent most of my time there. What do you think? You still got some people saying no. I agree. Yeah, I'm with you. Ooh, we got one yes, though. That's interesting. Well, let's hear from our no people, for those of you saying no. All right, Shantae says I could have been a visitor, right? Maybe I lived. And generally speaking, when people say like, where'd you live growing up? It means like the place where like you spent most of your time sleeping, right? Like what was your apartment or house situation where you spent most of your time sleeping? And maybe during the day, I spent most of my time in South Jersey, but at night, I would always go home to Central Jersey or North Jersey, or like maybe I lived in Pennsylvania, but I went to school in New Jersey. So that's why I spent most of my time there. Excellent. All right, going to add another premise. What if I tell you that my parents lived in South Jersey the whole time I grew up in South Jersey? Did that get me there? We got enough? I like Helen saying Central Jersey does exist. Sounds like a true Central Jersey person. I'm a South Jersey person, very suspicious of the idea that Central Jersey was a real place. Most of my life, I thought it was all North Jersey and South Jersey, and that's it. All right, so a lot of you are saying in this case, we still don't have enough, and Shantae nails it, right? What if I didn't live with my parents, right? Maybe my parents lived in South Jersey, so I spent a lot of time hanging out with my parents in South Jersey. That would explain premise 3, but I still went home maybe to my grandmom's place, and I lived with my grandmoms, or I lived with my aunt or something. Or as Franco said, maybe I grew up by myself. Maybe my parents shipped me off and had me live somewhere else alone by myself, right? It's unlikely, but it's still not enough because I could have lived with other people, not my parents, growing up. All right, how about this time? What if I tell you that I lived with my parents the whole time I was growing up? All right, I'm getting a bunch of yeses now. Yeah, do you see how this works? We can get all the way down to P4 where it feels like a lot of evidence, but until we get one additional piece of info, like premise 5, we can't definitively conclude this. I think premise 4 and premise 5 fully get us there. Franco might have a little concern here. I'd have to specify that premise 4 and premise 5 mean the following. My parents lived in South Jersey the entire time I grew up living in South Jersey. And then I lived with my parents the entire time I grew up. Would that sort of connect, Franco? Just to be super careful about it. That's what we mean. Premise 4 and premise 5 get us there. If my parents lived in South Jersey and I lived with my parents, then I lived in South Jersey with my parents growing up. That's how that would flow. So, awesome. This is how we evaluate support. We think about whether we got enough, not enough. And there's a tipping point where you can have a lot of support, but it's still not what I would say is enough to reach the conclusion. Here's how we evaluate arguments in general. Always check the truth of the premises, then always check the support. These are completely separate tests from each other. I think of them as like a 2 thumbs up system, right? When you're like the 2 thumbs up for movie reviews, you want both movie reviewers to say good things for you to say that this is an overall good argument. The truth test, you could pass the truth test, but fail the support test. And then the argument would be overall bad. We want 2 thumbs up. An argument could pass the support test, but fail the truth test. And then it would be overall bad. We want arguments that pass the truth test and pass the support test. Then they're overall good. And obviously some arguments could fail both tests and they would be overall bad, like twice as bad. All right, so now what we'll do is we'll evaluate some of these arguments together. Let's take this first one. You just go through a bunch of examples and we'll try to figure out whether we think this is a good argument or a bad argument. All right, so here's the argument. Jordan Peele is famous. Jordan Peele wrote the song Rockstar. Therefore, a famous person wrote the song Rockstar. Let's try to define our terms before we go ahead and evaluate this. Who's Jordan Peele? Someone tell us, who is he? Shantae, he's a director. Yeah. What specifically has he directed? Yeah, so he directed the movie Us and the movie Get Out. 2 sort of like awesome horror movies / social thrillers. And he also is an actor, as Monique says he was in Key and Peele. He was the Peele in the sketch show Key and Peele. Yeah, and he, I think he starred in that movie Keanu. Did he write it too? I forget. I don't know if Key and Peele wrote it or whatever, but Key and Peele were the stars of that movie Keanu. Awesome. So actor, comedian, director. How about the song Rockstar? The song of the summer I'm talking about, the one that was all over TikTok this summer. What's that song? I don't think it was Post Malone. Wasn't it DaBaby? Am I wrong about that? Also, the song the word Rockstar, there might be a bunch of different ones for that. Yeah, I think it was DaBaby. Oh yeah. I mean, one of those like pop rappers, right? Yeah, but this was like the song of the summer, and it had like two lives. It had a real big life on TikTok, and then when all the Black Lives Matter protesting happened, then DaBaby released a remix with a new verse that was like relevant to a lot of social justice stuff, and it took off even more at that point. I'll probably play it. You know how I like to play songs at the beginning and end of class? I'll play it at some point if you haven't heard it. Could have been better, Shanae? Yeah, as a song of the summer goes, it's like, it's chill. But yeah, I don't know. I definitely like the remix. But all right, so I want y'all to vote on this argument. Do you think this is a good argument? Do you think this is a bad argument? Are you not sure? I just opened a poll for y'all to vote. You can click 1, a good argument, 2, a bad argument, or 3, I'm not sure. And then I want you to, while you're voting, start thinking about why. Because the follow-up question I'm going to ask is, why do you think it's a good argument if you think it's good? Why do you think it's a bad argument if you think it's bad? What makes you unsure at this particular point if you're unsure? And then we got Franco already writing his thoughts in the chat. Franco says, this is good and bad, if and only if there are 2 Jordan Peeles, which one is famous and another wrote Rockstar. Just to be clear, we're only referring to the one Jordan Peele we were referencing. There might be another Jordan Peele out there on the planet. I don't know if you've ever met a person with a famous name. I grew up with someone whose name was Mike Schmidt, who's a famous baseball player from the 80s. But the Mike Schmidt I grew up with was not the famous baseball player. He was just some random dude. But we're just referring to, in this case, Franco, the one Jordan Peele we were just referencing, the director/comedian. Well, giving you something to look up, Franco, later. These movies, the movies he put out are pretty big, and he was on like sort of a smaller level, but still sort of well-known comedy show called Key and Peele that people are referencing. All right, a bunch of y'all have voted, and it looks like most of you think this is a bad argument. 4 people voted that it's a good argument. 9 went with a bad argument. 3 people said, I'm not sure. Let's talk about it. I think this is a bad argument. What specifically do you think is the flaw in this argument? All right. So Barbara says, how do we know if he actually wrote it, right? That second premise. And Shantae also focuses specifically on that second premise. Shantae says it would be bad because premise 2 isn't true. And I think that's exactly right. This second premise is false. Jordan Peele did not write this song. Jordan Peele's a director. Jordan Peele is a comedian. As far as I know, Jordan Peele is not a songwriter. He doesn't write songs. He does other stuff. And in this particular case, DaBaby wrote Rockstar. Oftentimes, the person performing the song is the one who wrote the song. Not always, though, but often. And in this particular case, also, there are some other credited writers of that song. Roddy Ricch is in there because he's got a verse in that song. And this random guy, Seth in the Kitchen, also, he's like, I guess, the producer. There's always some random unknown producer behind all these big pop songs that y'all are familiar with. All right, so that was an argument, failed the truth test. It's going to be bad when you have a false premise. Questions, thoughts, or concerns about that one before we move on to another one? Feel free to write nope, no questions in the chat. All right. Cool. All right, then. moving on. We're going to do this argument. Premise 1, SZA is 29 years old. Premise 2, Jamila Woods is 28 years old. Conclusion, SZA is older than Woods. So let's define our people before we vote on this one. Who's SZA? Someone tell us who SZA is, for anyone who knows who she is. The photos of them are on the bottom, by the way. SZA's on the left, Jamila Woods is on the right. Yep, she's a singer / artist. I like this. Yeah. Yeah, she put out a really awesome album. Either was it 2017 or 2018, a couple years ago. And I'm just very excited for her to put out another album. I really like that first album she put out. And she's got another one coming out soon. Getting me real excited. How about Jamila Woods? Who's Jamila Woods, y'all? Is she a little bit more obscure? I'm not sure. Lamar's not sure. Shantae, yep, she is a singer. Another sort of singer, sort of a neo-soul singer, or like an R&B artist. SZA's more on the pop side of things. Anyway, that's who they are. Time to vote on the quality of this argument. I just opened up a poll again for y'all to vote on. What do you think in this particular case? Is this a good argument? Is this a bad argument? Are you not sure whether this is a good argument or a bad argument? Go ahead and place your vote in this particular circumstance. All right. Just to give you a little tally, right now we got 8 people voting for it's a good argument. We got 2 people voting for it's a bad argument. We got 3 people voting I'm not sure. I want you to vote every time, even if you're not sure. Just vote, I'm not sure. So Franco says Woods is older, ? Unsure of the real age. Shantae says, I don't know how old they really are, so we don't know if the premises are true. So now we've got 8 people voting for good, 0 people voting for bad, and 8 people voting for I'm not sure. So it's almost a neck and neck race between it's a good argument and I'm not sure. Interesting. Isabel says it would be good if I could prove that's actually how old they are. And then Denzel says, assuming this is fact-checked, then it's a true or a good argument. All right, so with most of y'all in, here are the results. We have the biggest one going to the category I'm not sure. The winner with 10 votes is I'm not sure. And then 7 of y'all say it's good. Only 1 of you say it's bad. And then Monique says maybe if there was a birth date that was added, I like that possibility. That's interesting. Yeah, that would be fun to have a actual birthday added on it in the middle of an argument. But let's talk a little bit about this, particularly people who are saying it's unsure. It feels like the consensus is, like Shantae is saying, like Monique's saying, like Isabel's saying, like Denzel is saying, like, I'm not sure that that's actually their ages, but if that's their ages, it's true. What if you're not sure about the premises? What should you do in that sort of circumstance? This happens a lot in arguments. In actual real-life arguments, you're often unsure whether the premises are true. As Barbara says, then you Google it, right? But in the meantime, what you can do in this particular circumstance is label these premises before you Google to find out. You can label these as questionable premises. A questionable premise is a sort of premise that is neither true nor false yet, because you haven't figured out whether it's true or false. And that's why I wanted to introduce this argument, to show you that sometimes you can write, this is a questionable premise. I'm not going to say this is a good argument yet until I do some more research. So that's what we mean by a questionable premise, a premise that's not clearly true or false. And this is an example of a questionable premise that's empirical but unknown. What I mean by empirical is that it's an objective claim. There's a correct factual answer. There is a correct answer to the question, how old is SZA? And to the question, how old is Jamila Woods? In this particular case, the premise is either true or false. We just don't know it right now. And maybe we don't know it yet. And that's why it's an empirical but unknown claim. Empirically unknown claims are questionable. And there are different degrees of questionability or unknown ability when it comes to various sorts of premises out there. So if I tell you in an argument that Billie Eilish is a vegan, you might think to yourself, okay, maybe, but I don't know that right now. I guess I could find out with some Googling, as Barbara mentioned. But that's something that you could find out the answer to. You could definitely figure that out, even if you don't know it right now. Feel free to start Googling that to figure out whether Billie Eilish really is a vegan or whether she's not a vegan. What if I give you this sort of claim? There are exactly 186,214 hairs on my head. Do you know whether that's true or not? I hope none of you know whether that's true or not. This is the sort of claim where, could you find out the answer to this one? I mean, you couldn't find out the answer to this question by Googling it, right? You can't Google Sean Keegan-Landis hair count and find an answer. Could you find it out some other way? I don't know, maybe by sitting and counting all the hairs on my head. But that'd be super hard and super arduous, probably super boring. So I'm not sure any of y'all would actually want to do that. And I think I can see where Facundo's going in the chat here, right? By the time you count them, like another hair might have grown that you missed, or some hairs might have fallen out, right? Yeah, as Facundo says, I'm sure the number changed by the time you count them all, right? Yeah. So there is something tricky and tough about that. And then there's an even higher level of uncertainty or unknowability when people make claims that just like pretty much nobody knows the answer to right now. You see this a lot in really controversial arguments. The sort of arguments y'all were putting forward in the Unit 3 discussion. Here's an example. The death penalty deters murder. The question of the impact that the death penalty has on the murder rate is a really hard question to try to figure out the answer to. And that's what this particular claim in this sentence, the death penalty deters murder, says that having the death penalty in a society will make it so that fewer murders take place in the future. There are all these future would-be murderers who, because they're so scared of dying themselves and don't want to be sentenced to death, will think twice before committing their murder and not murder. That's what it means for the death penalty to deter or prevent future murders. That's a really hard question to figure out. Experts themselves within criminal justice and sociology have tried to answer this question using all sorts of various statistical fancy techniques, and they disagree. The evidence is currently mixed and inconclusive. So that's something where you should just shrug at the end of the day. The general idea is if you have a questionable premise, try to figure out the answer. Sometimes you'll shrug and say, I don't know, I guess the death penalty, it's not the sort of thing we can figure out. We don't like those sorts of premises. Empirical premises that remain questionable are bad evidence. But going back to this, anybody look up Billie Eilish as a vegan to try to figure out whether she is a vegan or isn't a vegan? That's one that you could try to figure out. Barbara says she is. What's your source, Barbara? How'd you figure that out? Back it up. Show me the receipts. Y'all didn't think I'd be challenging like this, did you? Right? As Shanae says, could be fake news. You type in Billie Eilish vegan, you get some random website that's just spouting lies about celebrity vegans. Oh, so Barbara just has some background on this. She saw an interview. Interesting. Yeah, we could also do this ourselves. We can all just go and Google this. All right, here it is. I'm going to click on it. You won't be able to see it, but let's just to see the source. This is Pitchfork, which is a music website about reviewing music and providing news about music. And in this interview, maybe she talks about being vegan. I don't know. I'm not going to watch all of it right now, but it might be in there. Little side note, I do also just happen to know that Billie Eilish is vegan from like doing the same sort of thing that Barbara does, watching a bunch of interviews with Billie Eilish. I think she's fascinating. She's an awesome pop star. So nice. So yeah, that's something you can figure out. But these sorts of death penalty deters murder ones, you might never figure out, and that would be bad evidence. All right, now let's go back to this argument. Did any of y'all look up the ages of SZA and the ages of Jamila Woods? How old are they? Are these premises true? Are they false? What do y'all think? All right, it's false. Which one in particular is false? Are they both false? All right, so the second premise that says Jamila Woods is 28 is false. Jamila Woods is 30. She's not 28. Nice. How about that first premise? Is that first premise true or false? Is SZA actually 29? All right, so the first premise is true. Nice, and that's correct. First premise is true. So since we have the second premise being false, that means now we can go from shrugging to saying, I'm not sure, to saying now this is actually a bad argument, now that we looked it up. But I really like how many of you in your voting first went with I'm not sure, because you don't just want to assume that the premises have been fact-checked. You don't just want to assume the premises are true when judging an argument. What you want to do is actually check the truth of the premises and then also check the support. That's the whole goal of evaluating arguments. Don't assume anything. Try to check the truth of our premises. All right, time to move on to another argument. This is argument number 3. Premise 1, wearing a mask restricts freedom. Premise 2, wearing a mask keeps us safer. Premise 3, freedom is more important than safety. Conclusion, I should not wear a mask. All right, talking controversy right now. Big topical stuff right now, talking specifically about wearing the sort of masks I'm wearing, or I guess more realistically, wearing these sorts of masks out in the world, out when shopping and indoors around other people during this COVID-19 pandemic. That's the sort of context in which this argument appears. So we're going to do some voting on this one. Do y'all think this is a good argument? Do y'all think this is a bad argument? Do y'all think this is, I'm not sure whether this is a good argument or a bad argument. Let's see where y'all would go on this one. Start typing out your reactions to this too, or unmute yourself. This one's designed to get us talking. We just dove headfirst into a more controversial argument. We started out with such basic ones. Now we're getting controversial all of a sudden. I got a bunch of y'all not voting. Go back to that poll. Remember, the poll is the little graph next to the hand raise button at the bottom of your screen. That little chart with a small blue line, a longer yellow line, and a medium length green line. Vote on what you think. Right now, I got 3 people who say it's a good argument, 8 people who say it's a bad argument, 3 people are not sure. All right. 4 people say it's good, 10 people say it's bad, 2 people say I'm not sure. So Lamar says this is heavily opinionated as an argument for something so controversial. There's something opinionated about this argument. I like that word opinionated in this particular case. All right, we're going to end the poll at this particular point. 4 of y'all went with a good argument, 11 of y'all went with bad, and 2 of y'all went with I'm not sure. So most of y'all think this is a bad argument. And Barbara says, piggybacking off of what Lamar said, that premise 3 in particular is heavily opinionated in this sort of way. But yeah, I think that that sort of premise is opinionated. I would label that one as questionable in much the same way we were just talking about questionable premises with our second argument about SZA and Jamila Woods. But this is questionable in a different way. And I feel like Lamar really nailed exactly how this is questionable. This is not an empirical claim. When I say that freedom is more important than safety, I'm not making an empirical claim. I'm making more of what we would call just generally non-empirical. It's not the sort of claim that science can get us the answer to, or Googling stuff can get us the objective answer to. There are a couple different types of non-empirical claims. Some are just purely objective, based on your personal preferences. So like whatever you think is the best flavor of ice cream, that's a subjective claim. Whether you think cake is tasty or if cake is too sugary or not so great. Well, how much you like a particular song is totally subjective. So I think Biba Doobie's song Care is really great. Not sure whether y'all like it or not, but I love it. Real vulnerable share for any of you Star Wars fans out there. I'm not that into Star Wars movies. There's like 2 of them that I kind of like. The rest of them I find kind of dull. Sorry, y'all, but you can recognize at least that it's subjective, what I'm saying. I'm not saying the truth. I'm not spouting an objective fact. Yeah, so Lamar, you're giving me the face that my wife gives me, because my wife is a pretty big Star Wars fan. I am a fan of The Mandalorian. Does that help? I like the TV show The Mandalorian. But sorry, I feel like I violated a sacred trust right now. I hope we can overcome this moment in our relationship. Those are all just personal preferences, what you like, what you dislike. Other sorts of claims are either based on your philosophy or morality and ethics. So think about all the moral values that are out there that are just broadly philosophical, that aren't based off of objective, scientifically provable facts. So we just saw one about safety trumping liberty or liberty trumping safety. Eating meat is immoral. You've heard vegetarians or vegans say something like that. The legal system is unjust is a popular criticism we're hearing these days, particularly among a large group of protesters. These are all examples of moral claims that are harder to prove empirically, in the sense that you could about whether Billie Eilish is a vegan or whether SZA is 29 years old. And then there are just like philosophical claims, like there's a God or there's an afterlife, or like there's sort of worldviews about like, well, people just don't change, or in general, the world is a pessimistic place. Science is reliably accurate, all these sorts of claims. With non-empirical claims, we still might want to try to find out the answer. But this is where it gets a little bit trickier. With empirical claims, we know what we have to do. We can do some Googling. We maybe have to do some scientific exploration or studies. With non-empirical claims, it's not clear that you can even find out the answer. Like for subjective preferences, like cake is tasty, is there an answer to the question, is cake tasty? It's not clear that there is, right? I mean, I could tell you my personal answer, but that might be different from your personal answer. And in general, what we like in arguments is we like there to be the answers as our premises, not personal answers. We want the premises to be true universally, not just true to me. We don't like arguments that have true to me premises. And now with values and worldviews, this is where doing philosophy can help. And this is a philosophy class, but oftentimes we can try to do some sort of analysis and maybe talk through. And this is the sort of thing that we'll be dealing with next week when we discuss productive disagreement. Oftentimes, a lot of disagreement stems from disagreements at the non-empirical values and worldview section of our beliefs. So let's go back to this particular thing and try to evaluate premise 3 specifically. What type of claim does this seem to be? Freedom is more important than safety. Well, I don't think it's empirical. I don't think we're talking about something that's fact-based, that you can just research and find the answer to. I think of this more as a moral claim, right? What's more important morally? Your right to freedom, your right to liberty, or the safety of people around you? So we're not going to do this now, but starting next week, we're going to be discussing how we can have a productive disagreement about a premise like this. And one of the things we could do is start thinking about what are the factors for this premise? What are the factors against this premise? But in general, it's not a good idea to have this sort of premise in an argument without itself being defended by other premises. We would more want that sort of claim, that freedom is more important than safety, to be argued as a conclusion in its own argument, rather than sitting as a premise, undefended, unsupported, in some other argument. That's not the sort of premise we like to have, just dangling there, undefended, unsupported, unargued for. Let's take a look, by the way, at this premise. Wearing a mask keeps us safer. You might think that's questionable as well. What type of claim is this particular premise? Is this an empirical claim? Is this a non-empirical personal preference? Is this a non-empirical moral value? Is this a non-empirical philosophical worldview? What type of claim do you think this is? You've got the possibilities that this is an empirical claim. You got the possibility that it's non-empirical, if I can spell, and it's just a personal preference. It's just your likes and dislikes. Maybe it's non-empirical, but it's a moral view about what's morally right and morally wrong. Or maybe it's non-empirical and it's a philosophical worldview, like there's a God or there's the afterlife or that sort of stuff. Which type of claim do you think premise 2 is? So Facundo's going with empirical. What about the rest of y'all? All right, Barbara says it's empirical. And then Barbara also says it's also proven. Shantae's going with empirical. Ashley is going with empirical. All right, so it seems like the consensus is starting to build that we're dealing with an empirical claim here. And I agree. I think this is the sort of claim where you'd have to look into the science for this, right? And as Barbara says, there does seem to be scientific evidence that me wearing a mask, at the very least, lowers the risk of me spreading COVID to others if I happen to have COVID myself. So that might be a reason why you would do this. Yep, so excellent. That's the exact sort of case where rather than just thinking about like your personal preference and having a productive disagreement, that's where you would just go and look into the science. You would start doing research. It wouldn't just be about Googling it for me. And when we're dealing with scientific claims, it would be about like digging into scientific journals and what the experts in epidemiology are saying. So excellent. Awesome. So all of that's just about premise 3. We're not going to talk about premise 1 just for the sake of time, but we could do the same analysis for premise 1. But for the sake of time, let's move on to a fourth argument. Here's argument number 4. I own this book. This book has a lot of writing and highlights in it. Therefore, I have read this book. I'm going to show you the book. About the I in this argument is me, your teacher, Sean. The book, for anyone curious, is called The Book of Why. One of the students in our class, Sam, should be familiar with this book because it's the book we're reading in a different class that she's in as well. And I'll just sort of randomly flip through to show you for premise 2 that the book has some highlights in it and some writing in it at various spots throughout it. So I want you all to try to figure out, is this a good argument? Is this not a good argument? Let me go and switch this over. It's poll time for argument number 4. What do y'all think? Good argument? Bad argument? Not sure? All right. Franco's voting in the chat. Also vote in the poll, Franco. We're getting a bunch of people on one side of this. We got 0 people voting for this to be a good argument, 8 people going with a bad argument, 3 people who are not sure. We're up to 11 bad, 3 not sure. All right. Oh, so I like what Franco's going. Franco's going with an explanation here in this one. Awesome. So with a bunch of us replying, it looks like most of us think this is a bad argument. I agree with a lot of what y'all are saying in this particular chat. Y'all are putting your exact finger identifying the problem here. Would you describe the concerns y'all are raising? And I'll just say all these concerns. Could be that this is a used book, but I happen to own it. Barbara says there are books you can buy that was already used. Isabel says just because it's your book and there are highlights in it doesn't mean that You're the one who read it. Shantae says someone else could have written in and highlighted that book. So in this particular case, what are you saying is wrong with this argument? Are you saying this is a truth problem, or are you saying this is a support problem? Excellent. See what Facundo just wrote here? Facundo says the premises don't fully support the conclusion enough. I think that's the exact problem in this particular case. This argument fails the support test. Even if both of these premises are true, and, spoiler alert, these premises are true, they do not support this conclusion. This is some evidence that I've read the book, but not enough evidence. So that's why this is bad support. Probably the word I would like to say rather than bad support is not enough support. This is not enough support. So we've got 2 questions in the chat right now I'd like to address. So Monique in the chat, well, how do you prove someone read something? It looks like they're writing a summary of some kind. So I really like how you're thinking about this. Like, how would you actually argue for that conclusion that I've read this book? And by the way, I have read this book. I am, after all, teaching or co-teaching a class where this is the book that we're using. So I have read it. But like, what would be my proof? As Monique says, maybe what you would ask me to do is write a summary of the book. And then you'd have to read the book yourself to see whether my summary was accurate enough to suggest that that's good proof that I read this, right? Or maybe you'd have me take a quiz on the book that just quizzed me on all the different parts of it. And if I did good enough on the quiz, that could be good evidence that I read the book, something along the lines of that, right? And then Franco says another question here. Another question comes out. If I didn't read it, how do I know the book has a lot of writings and highlightings? Well, one thing that you could just see is that I did just sort of flip through it. And maybe just in my flipping through it, the way that I'm flipping right now, I can see all the writing and highlights in it. And I'm flipping through without reading it right now. So that could be one way I would do that without reading it myself. Awesome. Really nice job on this one. We got one more argument that I want to do collectively as a class based off of these slides. And that's this particular, oh, right, sorry. I had the same slide saying the exact same things you all said in the chat. So I didn't even feel the need to move on to these slides. But see how I say it here? Maybe I bought it used, or maybe I'm trying to trick someone into thinking that I read the book when I actually didn't read the book. I don't know if you ever used to do that back in high school. Do you ever like trick your teacher into thinking that you read the book by just randomly highlighting parts of it to make it look like you were doing your work when you weren't actually? I don't know if anybody's that devious in here, but I've known some people who've done that. Anyway, here's our 5th and final argument. I have 2 ears. All people with 2 ears have at least 1 ear. Therefore, I have at least 1 ear. So again, this argument's about me. I got real self-centered toward the end of making these slides and made a couple arguments about me specifically. And just to give you some evidence about this, I'm going to tilt to the left so you can see my left ear. I'm going to tilt to the right so you can see my right ear. So that should be helpful for judging whether the first premise is true or false. Let's go ahead and vote on this argument. It's the last poll I think we'll be doing. Tell me what do you think. Is this a good argument? Is it a bad argument? Are you not sure? All right, we got 4 people voting that it's a good argument, 2 saying it's a bad argument, 1 who's not sure. We're up to 5 who say it's a good argument, 6, 7, we're up to 3 who think it's a bad argument, and still at 2 for I'm not sure. Now we're up to 11 who think it's a good argument. Still at 3 for a bad argument, 2 for I'm not sure. All right, so we'll end right now. Oh, Monique read it wrong, okay. 13 of us think it's a good argument. 3 say it's bad, 2 aren't sure. Most of us are saying this is a good argument. I think I'm with the people who think this is good. So tell me why. Tell me what's going on in this particular case. So Isabel in the chat writes, this is a good argument. It's impossible for someone who has 2 ears to not have at least 1 ear unless the definitions for 2 and 1 were changed. Yeah, right? If you understand the math behind those terms, 2 and 1, 2 is greater than 1. So if you have 2, you have at least 1. 2 is more than 1. So Isabel's doing a nice job of explaining why the second premise is true. That's one of the things that has gone right in this argument. What else has gone right in this argument? Lamar says you can chain together the premises and they can reach the conclusion. So that's the support test, right? We say premise 2 is true, and this passes the support test. Just to explicitly talk about the chain that Lamar is talking about, if I have 2 ears and everyone with 2 ears has 1 ear, then I, as a 2-eared person, have at least 1 ear. That logically follows. They can connect the dots. I like thinking about it as a chain, Lamar. That's nice. And Isabel said the last bit that we want to mention is that our first premise is also true. Not only is premise 2 true, premise 1 is true. I do have 2 ears. That's not a lie. That's correct. So both the premises are true, and we have enough support. That's why this is a good argument. That's what it takes for an argument to be good, right? Remember, we've got our 2 thumbs test. We've got the argument that has passed both of our tests, the truth test and the support test. We've seen a mix of arguments in the rest of these where one of the tests was bad, so it was overall bad. Either the support was bad, so it was overall bad, or the truth was bad, so it was overall bad. To count as a good argument, you got to pass both tests, your truth test and your support test. All right, so let me now remind you a little bit of what it is you have to do as a homework assignment in class this week. I just want to pull up the actual homework sheet itself. The very first page of this is all about evaluating these sorts of arguments. You're evaluating each one of these arguments in terms of, first and foremost, the truth tests. You see how what you're asked to do in both of these arguments is check the truth of premise 1 and the truth of premise 2. And there you would circle true, false, or questionable for each one of these. Then, once you're done the truth test, it's time for you to check the support. And you figure out whether you've got enough support, that's valid, or not enough support, that's invalid. Once you're done your truth tests and your support tests, you're ready to render your overall verdict. And you would say in arguments overall good, that means you would circle sound. Or if you've got an overall bad argument, you would circle unsound. So that's how I want you to go about evaluating all of the arguments on this homework assignment. Now, to get you some practice, there's also an ungraded activity posted in both Unit 3 and Unit 4. I thought we were going to get to this in Unit 3, but we didn't. So I also posted this in Unit 4. This is, as an ungraded activity, something you do not have to hand in. This is not something that you can do it or not do it. And this is totally available in both Units 3 and Units 4. And this particular worksheet, I think, does a better job of explaining exactly what it is I want you to do when evaluating arguments. So, Monique, what I'm going to do is, rather than go back to the first homework, I'm going to tell you how to evaluate the arguments on this ungraded activity, and then hopefully you'll see how it transfers to the homework. It should be somewhat clear once we do that. So let's just take a look at one of the arguments on here. We'll just look at the sample argument, for instance. So the way that this is structured is that the argument itself is in the middle, right here. Some dads have beards, all bearded people are mean, some dads are mean. And then on the left side, that's the truth test. We have true, false, or questionable for premise 1. We circled true for premise 1 here because it's true that some dads do have beards. Actually, in reality, that's true. Some dads have beards. And then we do the same thing for premise 2, circle true, false, or questionable for the claim all bearded people are mean. In this particular case, we circled questionable because The idea that all bearded people are mean seems to ultimately be a subjective claim, particularly the word mean. What's mean to you might not be mean to me. There's something subjective about that. And then, once we're done the left-hand side, everything over here, then it's time to go over here to the right-hand side to check the support. And the support is completely separate from the truth test. That support is about whether we've been given enough info in the premises to reach the conclusion. So notice that we went with valid for this case. Even though our argument failed the truth test, this is an example of an argument that passes the support test even though it fails the truth test. So you still have to check support, even if your argument has failed the truth test, because support is a completely separate idea. We don't care when testing for support whether we've got true premises or false premises. What we care about is whether the premises provide enough info. If it's false info or questionable info, when testing support, we want to try to figure out whether we've been given enough info to reach the conclusion. So usually what I do is I ask myself to imagine a world where all the premises are true, and then try to figure out if the conclusion has to be true in that imaginary world. So in this particular case, I would imagine a world where some dads have beards. That's not that hard. But the harder thing would be to imagine a world where all bearded people are mean. Try to think about what that world would be like. Everybody who has a beard is super duper mean. Maybe it's just something about beards that make people mean. Maybe beards are super itchy or something. And just everybody who grows a beard is constantly just upset by their beard. So they're constantly yelling at other people and projecting and taking it out on others. So in this imaginary world, where everybody with a beard is mean, and some dads do have beards, do we know that some of those dads have to be mean? Do these premises, if true, prove this conclusion? That some dads are mean? I know you see the answer in front of you right now, but think about it. Doesn't it feel like that logically makes sense? As Onel says, yeah, that does follow. We can figure out the conclusion from these premises. If you know that some dads have beards and everyone with a beard is mean, then you can figure out the dads with beards all have to be mean. So those some dads with beards are the mean dads. And that's exactly what I wrote as an explanation in my little explanation over here. The premises tell us bearded dads are mean. So those are the some dads who are. Excellent, Janae. Excellent, Anel. Now that I'm done my truth test and my support test, I'm ready to render my overall verdict. Notice that I don't go to this bottom box in the middle until I'm done the left side and the right side first. Only after I'm done the left side and the right side do I go down to the overall. And this overall is just based off of the work I've already done on the left side checking truth and the right side checking support. And in this case, we just care about whether the argument's overall sound or overall unsound. Sound means perfect, and unsound means flawed. So all I have to do is look at the work I already did. Did I say nothing but good things about the argument? If so, I would circle sound. Or did I say flawed things about this argument? Did I point out any flaw in this argument? And in this case, I did. I pointed out that this is a questionable premise. So that is enough right there to make this argument unsound. And that's my explanation. We failed the truth test specifically in premise 2. Premise 2 was untrue, or more specifically, questionable. So Monique asked, is there an answer key with ungraded activities that you give? Oh, thank you for setting me up like I'm a hero. Yes, there is. There is an answer sheet. It is already posted on Blackboard. I'm going to show you where it is. It's in both Unit 3 and Unit 4, if you want to take a look at it. But I'm going to switch over to this and go to course content. If you go down to this week's unit, Unit 4, scrolling all the way down past the graded assignments, here's the ungraded activity right here. Not only is the sheet itself here that you can click on, The answer sheet is also here. A really good way for you to practice is to try your hand at every one of these arguments on here and then compare your answers to the answer sheet. See how well you're doing in each one of these. Hopefully that will help you through this. And that will be extra help for your homework itself. The homework's in slightly different format right here, but it's the same basic thing. Check the premises in terms of truth, then check the support, whether the premises support the conclusion, and then that'll help you determine the argument's overall quality. That's what you'll be doing for each one of these arguments on the homework. So thank you for asking, Monique. You read my mind about what I was about to say next. By the way, all of these things have some new terms that we haven't talked about too much yet. The words valid and invalid, and the words sound and unsound. I want to just briefly introduce those ideas to us right now. So I'm going to switch over to another set of slides that is also available on Blackboard. I'm just a fan of sharing all my stuff with y'all. So anytime I got something, I share it with you. Oh, did I not share? Yeah, I shared the right one. Good. So I'm going to make this one bigger and then share the bigger version. Here we go. Hopefully you see this now as one big old slide. Good. So in general, what we've been talking about in class so far is this idea of how to evaluate arguments in general. We're always checking those two things. Does anyone remember already what our mantra is? What are the two things we check? I'm going to be asking you this all the time. What are the two things we check when we evaluate any argument? Y'all forgot already? We've said it so many times already this class. What are these two things we check? Yes, Leah. Yes, yes. I'm brainwashing y'all. Thank you. Barbara and Leo got both of them, truth and support. William and Denzel were being polite about it and just saying truth first. But yeah, we care about the truth of the premises and whether the premises support the conclusion. So a deductive argument is sort of the stereotypical highest standard argument. A deductive argument is one where we're trying to absolutely prove the conclusion. This might not make a lot of sense to you now. It only makes sense when we start contrasting deductive arguments with other types of arguments later on, like in Unit 6 and Unit 7. But some arguments don't try to prove their conclusion. They just try to say the conclusion's probably true. Deductive arguments don't accept probably. Deductive arguments want the absolute high standard of absolute proof. So we have some specific words that we use just for deductive arguments. So those words I mentioned, valid, invalid, sound, unsound. Well, we don't use those words on the truth side. So we still stick with the same words we've been using when we check the truth of the premises. We use the words true and false, and also the word questionable. We don't really change things on the truth side. The fancy words valid and invalid start to pop up on the support side. The way we've been framing it so far, we've been thinking about the support as whether we've been given enough information in the premises to figure out the conclusion or to prove the conclusion. And that's generally been like, do we have enough or do we not have enough? It's enough or not enough. Well, the words valid and invalid are basically synonyms for enough support and not enough support. A valid argument is an argument that has enough support. An invalid argument is an argument where the premises do not give us enough support. More specifically, if you wanted a fancier definition here, this is a sort of entailment relationship where the premises being true guarantees the conclusion being true. If the premises were true for a valid argument, the conclusion would have to be true. We're not saying the premises are actually true on the support side. We don't care about whether their premises are actually true or actually false. But we're saying if you imagined that imaginary world where the premises were true, an argument with valid support would mean the conclusion would have to be true in that imaginary world. And an invalid one's just the opposite. If the premises were true, the conclusion doesn't have to be true. The conclusion could still be false in this imaginary world. So that's the idea of valid and invalid. Notice we don't say an argument that's valid is overall good or bad. All we're saying with the word valid is that it's passed the support test. On the overall side of things, that's where we introduce the words sound and unsound. We've just been using the words good and bad so far for an overall good argument, but this is based off the truth and support test. We said we have this 2 thumbs test. Our first thumb is the truth test. Our second thumb is the support test. An overall good argument has to pass both of those. Well, we use the word sound for an overall good argument and the word unsound for an overall bad argument. In my world, I would just replace these words with perfect and flawed. I think a sound argument is perfect and an unsound argument has a flaw in it or multiple flaws in some place. And then just to further specify what we mean by perfect, we say it's passed both tests. Our thumbs are up for both of the tests. All the premises are true, good, and support is valid, enough. So that's passing both tests. Unsound means we've failed at least one of the tests. Either we've got an untrue premise, or we've got invalid support, or maybe we've got both, an untrue premise and invalid support at the same time. We have at least one of the flaws on one of the tests. One of the thumbs is down. That's how you evaluate deductive arguments. It's scary when you see the words valid, invalid, sound, and unsound out of context. This, I think, is a great slide to just have as a nice visual for what valid means, what invalid means, what sound means, what unsound means. And I'm going to be sort of obnoxiously pedantic in this class, where I'm going to demand that we use these words in exactly how they mean in this class. Because I think sometimes people use the word valid as in like, oh, that's a valid argument in everyday life, where they mean that's an overall good argument. In this class, we do not say a valid argument is overall good. We have a word for an argument that's overall good. It's the word sound. An argument that's valid is just an argument that's passed the support test. We don't know whether it's passed the truth test yet. We need to know that for the valid argument to count as sound. All right, so maybe what we can do right now is practice this a little bit and do 1 or 2 of the arguments on this ungraded activity that we have right here. So I'm going to switch back to that ungraded activity, which as always is right here. Why don't we take a look? I'm trying to think which ones could we do here. Yeah, let's do argument number 2 on this one right now. Oops, I'll try to make this so that you only see argument number 2. Make it a little bit less cluttered visually. So argument number 2 says all the students in this critical thinking class are humans. All teenagers in this critical thinking class are humans. Therefore, all students in this critical thinking class are teens. Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to check the truth of each premise first before we check support and overall. What do y'all think about this first premise? Is that true? Is that false? Or is that questionable? What should I circle or highlight over here? All the students in this class are humans. All right. Yeah, feels pretty obviously true, right? Good. I'm glad you all think we're all humans here. Anybody who's not a human is doing a really good job of tricking us in this live session. Nice job. All right, how about the second premise? All the teenagers in this class, the people who are 13 to 19 years old, are humans. What do y'all think? True, false, or questionable for premise 2? Oh, is this one trickier? All right. So Facundo says it's true, doesn't support. Remember, right now, all we care about is truth, right? Oh, so Monique asks, well, what if there are no teens in this class? That's interesting. I wonder if that would be true or false. Let's just do a quick check. Anyone in here a teenager? Anyone here between the ages of 13 and 19? All right, so we do have some 19-year-olds. A bunch of y'all. Oh, very nice. Ghost? I'm not sure what Franco's thinking about here, but I'm intrigued. Say more about what you're thinking. But yeah, we do have a bunch of teens in here, which is nice. And I think all of y'all are 19. I think Ashley and Emma and yeah, Monique, that makes you a teen. You're still a teen until you hit 20, right? Yeah, normally when I think of teen, I'm with you. I think of like a high school student, right? Corey's out of it. But 19 can still count as a teenager for a little bit. Even though you're an adult, you're still a teen. All right. Now we're done the truth side. Both of these premises are true. Little side point, by the way, to actually answer your question, Monique, in logic, we tend to think that all claims that are what you would call empty, where there is nobody that's a teenager, would still count as true. So if I say like all Martians are green, most of you would say like, I'm not sure that's true. I would put that false. But technically by logical standards, since there are no Martians, but let's just assume for this that there are no Martians, that would mean that it's true that all Martians are green. It's just true by dint of the fact that there are no Martians. Weird side point to go into that right now. If you were taking a formal logic class, we would do this. You were teenage years old when you found out you're still a teen, Monique. I love that. Yeah. In Today I Learned. That's a fun one. All right, now it's support time. We're going to go to the right. And one of the things I like to do when testing support is really, really remind myself that I don't care about whether the premises are true or false. So what I like to do is literally scroll away or cover up the truth test when it's time for the support test. I don't care anymore whether the premises are actually true or actually false. When it's support time, all I care about is that weird little thick arrow that connects the premises arrow down to the conclusion. Do these premises logically lead to this conclusion? A bunch of y'all were already saying what you thought about this in this particular case. But what do the rest of y'all think? Do these premises get us to the conclusion? If you know all the students in here are humans, if you know all the teenagers in here are humans, do we now know all the students in here are teenagers? What do y'all think? Valid or invalid? Got a bunch of no's, it does not. These seem to be cases for saying this is invalid. All right, I agree with all of you. Excellent. Somebody tell us why now. This is a particularly tricky thing. Why is it that our premises aren't enough supports? Because Corey was also talking about it earlier. A bunch of y'all were saying this earlier. What specifically can you say about these premises that tell us why it's not enough information in this particular case? So Shantae says some students can be adults. Yeah. Does the first premise tell us anything about how old the students in this class are? First premise doesn't, right? Because remember, the conclusion is trying to say everyone in here is a teenager, right? All the students in here are teens. The first premise just says all the students in here are humans. Okay, great. We don't know how old, right? As Shantae says, by this standard, some of the students could still be old. Second premise says all the teenagers in this class are humans. Based off of that, do we know how many teenagers there are in this class? Premise 2, just looking at premise 2, does that tell us how many of the students in here are teens? Whether it's all or some or none? No, right? Absolutely, right? We still don't know. And we can't even combine premise 1 and premise 2 together to figure this out. We know all the students in here are humans. We know all the teens in here are humans. We don't know how many humans are teens. We just know all the teens are humans. We don't know that all the humans are teens. So in this particular case, the premises just don't tell us what we're looking for. The premises don't tell us how many students in this class are teenagers. Looks like I did this already at autofilled. Nice. So that's exactly what I would write as my little explanation. By the way, a little reminder, you don't have to write anything on this homework when you're evaluating arguments. That's also going to be true for next week's test. But for this ungraded activity, I think it might be helpful for you to get in the habit of really thinking through and being able to explain why you're voting for valid or why you're voting for invalid in these support tests. And as Monique says, if you flip this argument and put premise 2 as the conclusion and the conclusion as premise 2, you did that sort of flip, then it would in fact count as logical supports. That might in fact work out. Well, let me make sure that's right. Let's see. All students in the class. Even then, by the way, Monique, it would work out. What you need to do is flip teenagers and humans in premise 2. In premise 2, if it said all humans are teenagers, then we could get to the conclusion that all students in this class are teenagers. That's the only way it would logically work out. But switching the premise 2 and the conclusion wouldn't get us there. Interesting. All right, now we're ready to render our overall verdict. And in this particular case, as in every case, our overall verdict is just a summary of the work we've already done. What does sound mean? Perfect. What does unsound mean? Flawed. So in this case, do we have a sound argument? It's perfect. Or do we have an unsound argument that's flawed? What do you think? What do we have in this case? Isabel's going with unsound. Corey's going with unsound. Lamar's going with unsound. Yeah, all of y'all are exactly right. One's pretty clearly unsound. And then we've got another spot for us to explain why. So let's go ahead and break out the fill, sign, and send thing again. What's our explanation for why this argument's unsound? Well, here, just to remind yourself, to go back what we wrote in the sample, all you have to do is point back to what you already said on either the truth side or the support side. If it's a flawed argument, what's the flaw you already mentioned? So in number 2, we say it's an unsound flawed argument. What's the flaw we've already mentioned in this case? What flaw did we already say this argument has? All right, Isabel says the support is invalid. Exactly right. That's exactly what I would write here. I would just say it's got invalid support. That's our flaw in this particular case. So I think it's very helpful to go through all of these in this slow, systematic way, just for you to practice evaluating deductive arguments. And there are a total of 15 on here, which means there's a total of 15 explanations on the answer sheet to this ungraded activity. And then you could go to the graded thing, your homework, and evaluate 6 more of these. Sorry, 8 more of these. Just a cornucopia of arguments for you to evaluate. So many arguments to evaluate. All right, last thing I want to do in this class today is talk about this multiple choice section. Because I did a little foreshadowing. I mentioned how hard this multiple choice question can be because it's talking about these abstract terms we might not be fully comfortable with yet. It's asking about the relationship between sound arguments and valid or invalid arguments, or the relationship between invalid arguments and whether the premises are true or false or whatever. It's talking about the relationship between valid arguments and sound arguments. It's talking about the relationship between arguments with false premises and validity and soundness and the like. So there are a bunch of different types of questions on here that are all asking you to sort of think at a very abstract level about the relationship between each and every one of these terms. So I want you to try to think a little bit about this. Let's take, I don't know, this argument or this question as an example. If a deductive argument is invalid, then what else follows from it? We're just going to focus on this one right here. See if I can make it so that we can only see it. Such a fan of making it so that we can only see one question. All right. I want to show you how I would go about trying to figure out the answer to this particular question. And for me, it involves creating a little bit of a diagram to help me out here. I'm going to show you what this diagram looks like. I'm going to do a little switch here just to sort of show you what I have in mind. So I've created it on a Word document, but you could just write this out on a piece of paper using a pen, figuring it out yourself for sure. And I like that Corey's giving us an answer already, but I just want to show you how you go about doing this. What I've just done is basically taken the template that is in our ungraded activity and just sort of like written out all these different possibilities. So on the left over here, we've got the truth test. On the right, we've got our support. And beneath the argument, we've got the overall. Right in the middle, here's the argument itself. So I guess I can just write a little argument right here. There. All right, so in this particular case, this question asked us to think about what happens when you have an invalid argument. Let's say you're told that you've got an invalid argument. What I would do in this particular circumstance, go up here to support and say, hey, I've been told this is an invalid argument. So, whoops. So what I'm going to do is write invalid up here. And then when I know that it says invalid, it means we've got not enough support. That just sort of reminds me, invalid means not enough support. I have labeled invalid in the right location. Now what I want to do is try to figure out what else I can learn about this argument now that I've been given this. And sometimes the answer is, I can't learn anything else. But sometimes the answer is, I can learn a lot more. So first off, let's go over to the truth. Can we figure out whether the premises are true or false now that we know the support is invalid? What do y'all think? Can we figure out anything about the truth of the premises right now? What do y'all think? I'm just trying to fill out the rest of the boxes here. Can we figure out whether the premises are true? Can we figure out whether the premises are false? Or could the premises be either true or false? It doesn't matter. What do y'all think? Lamar says either. It could go either way. Isabel says the same thing with Lamar. Could be either. Do y'all say either or either? Apparently I say it both ways. Yeah, so I'm with y'all in this particular case. I think this is something we're learning right here. For this particular one, we don't know whether the premises are true. We don't know whether the premises are false. The support test tells you nothing about the truth test. That's what it means that these are completely separate and independent from each other. All right, awesome. Now let's go and fill out the overall box down here. Do we know, based off of this, whether overall this argument is sound or overall this argument is unsound? Do we know? Do we not know? What do you think? Is there information that tells us whether this is a perfect argument or a flawed argument at this point? All right, so Isabel says, yeah, it's flawed. I can almost hear the way she would say it because I've been in an actual in-person class with Isabel. I know how she talks. Corey says the support's invalid, making it a flaw. So that's unsound. It's exactly right. Both Isabel and Corey are nailing this. You would say in this particular case, this is an unsound argument. So, and we learned that. We can even say, as Corey did, because it's invalid, as a little just reminder to us that that's why this argument is unsound. Now we've learned something. We didn't learn anything on the truth side, but we did learn something about the argument's overall quality. Now we can go back to this particular homework question. Where are you at? Right here. And we can see it's asking us about whether the argument's sound or unsound. Well, we figured it out. In this case, it seems pretty clear the answer is B. It's got to be unsound. And that's exactly what, was it, who said that up here? Corey said at the very start. Yeah, and Monique says these boxes remind me of Cornell notes for some reasons. I don't know if anybody uses Cornell notes. It's a note-taking system where you have a bunch of columns and boxes, and it's like, it's for hyper, like, organization nerds. So it sounds like Monique's got like an organization nerd background, which is cool. Yeah, it's a good note-taking system if you ever learned it. I never learned it myself, so I've only seen other people use it. All right, so you can do this sort of thing for any one of these arguments. So let's just practice some more that may or may not be the actual homework questions here. I'm going to, where are we at here? I'm going to go back to this, and I'm going to erase everything we just filled in right here. I'm going to erase this, erase this. I'm going to erase what's written over here. And let's give us a different prompt down here. Rather than saying we're dealing with an invalid argument, let's say I tell you that this argument overall has a false premise. And that's all we know about this particular argument. What can we learn from that? Well, the first thing I like to do is fill out exactly what we were given. So let's say we just label our first premise as false. That's our given right here. We've got a false premise. Oh, given is purple. I got to make this purple. Sorry, y'all. Do we know anything about the other premise, whether the other premise is true or false? Yep, right, we don't. So this one remains unsure. Do we know anything about whether the support is valid or invalid? What do y'all think? Isabel says we don't. Lamar says we don't. Good. This is a common thing that sometimes tricks students. But here we still don't know. Truth and support are separate. What you write on the truth side is completely separate from what you write on the support side. So you can't learn anything about an argument's support by learning about the argument's truth. Awesome. Overall, now, do we know anything about this argument's overall quality? Is this a perfect argument? Is this a flawed argument? Are we not sure? What do y'all think? So Isabel says it's flawed. Yeah. Barbara and Shantae also say it's flawed. Absolutely. So that means this is an unsound argument. The particular flaw in this case is a false premise. I guess I'll just shorten it to F for false premise. There you go. So now, if you are faced with this on the homework, an argument with a false premise, you don't know whether the support's good or bad, but you do know that the argument's overall unsound. Well done, y'all. So Monique says, so essentially with this sound and unsound system, there's no gray space. It's strictly black and white. That is exactly what a deductive argument is. It's a black and white argument. It's either a sound argument that's perfect, or there's a tiny flaw or a big flaw or a medium flaw, and it's imperfect. Yep, it's flawless versus flawed. That's it. We're going to be dealing with other arguments later this class that are not black and white like this, that do have shades of gray to them. But that's not deductive arguments. Yeah, as Lamar says, it turns the gray area into black and white. That's why these aren't the only arguments we're studying, right? These arguments have a limitation to them, but they are useful in some places. Useful in contexts where black and white makes sense. All right, let's do one or two more of these just so we get the habit of this. What if I tell you that we know we've got a valid argument in this case? I'm going to get rid of everything else that we just have here. Get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this, get rid of this. I know I have a valid argument. The nice thing about this particular diagram that I'm setting up for myself is I know exactly where to write my given. Right up here, we've been told that it's valid. I've put it in the support box because that's the only place where it goes on the support side of things. All right, so I've told it's valid. What do I know about the truth? Do I know whether the premises are true or false? Anything over there? What do y'all think? Isabel says you don't know. I know I sound like a broken record, but it's really important to highlight this over and over and over again. Your truth test and your support test are completely separate. So we don't know anything about the truth of the premises from the truth of, or from the support. The support's good, premises could be false. Premises could be true, we don't know. All right, now it's overall time. What do y'all think? Overall, do we know whether this is a perfect argument or a flawed argument? Or do we not know? What do y'all think? We have enough info to figure out that this is a perfect argument? Have we figured out that there's a flaw in this argument? Are we not sure? Corey's saying it could be either. Y'all agree with Corey? All right, Lamar's with Corey on this one. Could be either. And I agree as well. Yeah, this is a case where we don't have enough info yet. Because to figure out whether it's perfect or not, we have to know both thumbs, whether both thumbs are up. And we don't know whether the truth thumb is up or down. We know the support thumb's up, so it could still be perfect. But depending on where the truth goes, it's either perfect, if it's all true premises, or flawed if one of the premises isn't true. So if you see one of these where it asks you if a deductive argument's valid on the homework or on a test, and it then asks you to figure out anything else, you have to be like, no, dog, I don't know anything else. I just don't know whether the premises are true. I don't know whether the argument's overall sound or unsound. I don't know. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Questions, thoughts, or concerns about any of this? And one thing I'll do as you're thinking of possible questions or concerns, let's go back to the homework slide itself, where you can see all of these multiple choice ones. We've already gone over some of these in class right now. The last section of the homework, I want to emphasize, please provide original examples. I know of all the examples you can find online. Don't use one of the examples online. Don't Google like valid false premise argument or unsound valid argument examples. Come up with your own original examples in this particular section. And we're pretty much out of time for class today. Well, not out of time, but I'm going to call it today. This is what you have to do for class. This homework assignment, that's due Wednesday. And then your discussion posts, as always, we have a weekly discussion post. First one's due Saturday, 2 replies due Wednesday. I will stick around for the next couple minutes if anyone still has questions or concerns. So Monique asked, is there a third possible response, not having enough info? Will that be on the test? Yeah, so you'll see that sometimes on this particular homework assignment, the answer is sometimes it could be valid or invalid, or it could be sound or unsound, or sometimes it's none of the above, or sometimes it's not enough info to determine. That will always be on tests or homework assignments as possibilities, Monique. All right, I'll stick around, but have yourselves a good one. Enjoy your weekend, everybody. Enjoy. Y'all too.